In this presentation, we're going to be talking about 6/4 chords, the most unstable of the triads that we've encountered so far in the common practice era. A second inversion triad, or 6/4 chord, is an unstable chord, meaning that it can't be used freely. Our first inversion and root position chords, we can use them pretty much anytime we want. But with 6/4 chords, they have to conform to specific uses in the common practice era. And if we don't do that, it starts to sound out of style. Starts to sound like it's not something that Mozart or Bach or Beethoven, early in his style, would have used. These uses include cadential 6/4s, passing 6/4s, neighbor or pedal 6/4s, and oscillating, arpeggiated, and melodic 6/4s. Let's take a look at these. Cadential 6/4 chords are probably among the most common type of second inversion chord that we'll see. The cadential 6/4 arose from the use of suspensions over a dominant harmony before a cadence. So, let's imagine that a cadential progression in C major sounds like this. So there we have a 1 chord, a 5 chord, and another 1 chord. Let's say that we delay that resolution of the 1 chord just a little bit. That's pretty much how the 6/4 chord got its start. So the cadential 6/4 has two important properties. First, it looks like a 1/6/4 chord. It's always going to look like a 1/6/4 because of the way that it evolved. Second, it's almost always followed by a 5 chord. And if it's not followed by a 5 chord, we have such an expectation, such a ritualized expectation that it wants to be followed by a 5 chord, that if a composer doesn't do that, they're doing it for a very specific purpose. For instance, when we're doing cadenzas in a classical style, the composer always ends on a 6/4 chord. Then the cadenza happens, and then we get the 5 chord. That whole cadenza is just making us wait for that resolution of the 5, because the composer knows that they've got us in the palm of their hands, and because we're waiting for that 1/6/4 to resolve. Now, when we're analyzing this can get a little tricky, because different people like to call this different things. So, let's take a look at some of these schools of analysis with dealing with this chord. There's a 1/6/4 CAD method of doing this. This shows that the pitches conform to a second inversion tonic chord displaying a cadential function. Personally, this is the method that I like because it tells us the pitch makeup of the chord, G, C, and E in the context of C major, and it tells us its function. It's a 6/4 chord that has the pitches of a 1 chord, and it's cadential. It's moving to a 5 chord. So I find that to be highly specific, and I like that. Another school of thought, which I certainly understand, and many of you might be familiar with, is the 5/6/4/5/3 method. This shows that the unstable pitches function as suspensions and ultimately resolve to a 5 chord. In some ways, this is really good because it gets at the evolution of the 6/4 chord that we talked about. But I can find that this sometimes is confusing, as 5/6/4s are frequently used in this used in the common practice era, and so this notation can be ambiguous because a 5/6/4 sounds completely different. There's a 5/6/4. So this notation I find to be ambiguous, and there's some issues with it, but other people find it descriptive, and you might have encountered that as well. A middle ground is the CAD 6/4 school. It bypasses any specific harmonic analysis, but demonstrates the function of the sonority. So if you're taking a course in harmony, then figure out what your professor likes to call it, and just know that different people call this chord different things. And if the class that you're taking is mine, just know that I prefer the 1/6/4 CAD version, but I certainly understand if you call it one of these other kinds. Let's talk about neighbor or pedal 6/4 chords, which are also very common, and they mean basically the same thing. They just describe different aspects of the chord. Both of these are referring to a 6/4 chord that prolongs a given harmony. In other words, it moves away from it and then comes back to it. It's kind of like a conversational turn, and then suddenly we're back around to the main idea. Some analyze this phenomenon as a pedal 6/4 because the bass note remains the same over the prolongation area. Here we've got an F major progression. And we start with an F major chord. We then go to a 4/6/4, and then back to a 1 chord. Note that the bass stays the same. So that's why some folks call it a pedal 6/4, because that bass note is acting like a pedal tone. But some folks call it a neighbor 6/4 because two of the upper voices tend to display neighbor motion. Let's look at that soprano voice. There we've got like a little neighbor tone on top. Same deal with the tenor voice in this case. So calling it a neighbor 6/4 is perfectly fine. The important thing to remember here, though, is that when we're talking about neighbor motion, we're talking about what's happening in the upper voices. We're not talking about what's happening in the bass voice. It's quite rare to have, let's say we did a 1 and then a, let's see, that would be a 3/6/4. 1, 3/6/4. First of all, the harmonic progression isn't great. But also, that's not really working. So what I'm playing in the bass, F, E, F, that's not the neighbor motion we're talking about. We're talking about neighbor motion in the upper voices. So if you're calling it a pedal 6/4, you're talking about what's happening in the bass voice. You're describing that pedal motion, or the lack of motion. And if we're talking about the neighbor 6/4, we're talking about what's happening in the uppermost voices. Passing 6/4 chords are also quite common, and these again refer to what's happening in the bass. So there we see a bass motion that is essentially passing between frequently two chord members. So here we've got a 1 chord, a 5/6/4, and a 1/6 chord. If we took out that 5/6/4 chord, we'd just be changing between 1 and 1/6. And that 5/6/4 is essentially filling in the gaps, just like a passing tone would in the bass voice. Now let's take a quick look at this voice leading here. Note that the 5th of the chord in the 6/4 chord is doubled. This is very common and is absolutely fine. We'll note that frequently it's the root that is doubled, but in certain situations, like dealing with the 6/4, doubling the 5th is just fine. Also note, between the bass voice and the alto, we get a nice little voice exchange. And very smooth voice leading, which is helped out by the fact that the 5th is doubled in that 6/4 chord. Now we can talk about arpeggiated and melodic 6/4 chords. Arpeggiated 6/4s just demonstrate the chord being arpeggiated. So there's an F major triad in the bass. We get up to that 6/4 sound. It's just in the context of an arpeggiation, and that's just fine. Similarly, melodic 6/4s are the result of a melody occurring in the bass voice, forming at some instances what would technically be a 6/4 chord. However, in this case, because the bass voice is sounding as a melody, typically with the accompaniment in the upper voice, one tends to not hear it as a functional progression, but simply as a melody. For instance, in Schumann's Album for the Young, here we have the Wild Rider. Here the bass voice is functioning as the melody, and the right hand is definitely functioning as harmonic support. Pardon my wrong notes there at the end. But basically we just have those appearances of the 6/4 chord just acting either as arpeggiations, or if we wanted to think of them as melodic 6/4s, that's perfectly fine too. Oscillating 6/4s do occur, but they tend to be more of a Romantic era occurrence rather than a Baroque and classical occurrence. Here we have Frédéric Chopin's Funeral March from the Piano Sonata No. 2. And what's usually happening here is 6/4s moving back and forth from the 6/4 to another chord. And it's just oscillating back and forth. The function is almost created more out of repetition than anything else. Certainly a lot of the voice leading motion is smooth here, but we can feel almost a sinister lifting there. And I think part of that is due to the fact that it's an unstable chord. So not just the fact that it's in B flat minor, that it's slow, that it's repetitious, that we have all these different aspects. That's not just what makes it interesting and, as I say, sinister. I think it's that we hear that that sort of roughness, that sense of uncertainty from the 6/4 chord. It's quite cool. So to recap, second inversion triads or 6/4 chords are unstable. They have to be used with care. And in the common practice era, 6/4 chords can only be used in certain ways. When you are analyzing a 6/4 chord, they must be analyzed using one of the following functions. If you put 6/4 next to a chord and you don't use one of these, your analysis is incomplete. And if you're doing an assignment or a test, that means points will be taken off. So these functions include cadential, passing, neighbor and pedal, arpeggiated, melodic, and oscillating. If you need to go back and refer to these, that's absolutely fine. Sometimes it takes a while for them to filter in. But know that the cadential, passing, and neighbor chords are probably the most common in the common practice era. Then come arpeggiated and melodic. And then we get to oscillating 6/4 chords, mostly when we get to the Romantic era.